The New York Mets have a new hitting coach, but the bigger news is that Antoan Richardson, the Mets' first base coach and stolen base guru, will not be back in 2026.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. I've been covering the New York Mets on this show since the 2019 season. It's the number one daily podcast on the New York Mets. If you want to find any of my written work, you can do so over at justbaseball.com, where I work as the editor-in-chief. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Now, the New York Mets made a new hire today. Troy Snitker is the new hitting coach. And I'll talk about that in the next segment, but that story immediately took a back seat because a couple of hours later, Jeff Passan reported for ESPN that the New York Mets and first base coach Antoan Richardson have not come to terms on a new contract, and Richardson is expected to leave the organization. Now, it was, I don't know, maybe a week ago at some point, it was reported that Antoine Richardson and the Mets were in contract negotiations, but he did not have a deal for 2026. When the season ended and the Mets cleaned house with their coaching staff, it appeared like Carlos Mendoza obviously was going to be back as the manager, and Antoine Richardson would be retained as the first base coach, and everything else was in flux. And that made sense because Antoine Richardson was that good at his job in 2025. The New York Mets were the most efficient team in Major League Baseball in stealing bases, and Juan Soto nearly went 40-40, which would have been the most improbable 40-40 season in MLB history. Instead, he sells for the most improbable 30-30 season in MLB history. It was a remarkable year for a first base coach. There is no other way to describe it. But because of that, because of the reputation that Antoine Richardson now has, he wants to test his market. And he has every right to do so. His contract expires after the World Series. And I think just by what has been reported today, my assumption here is not that there is some job necessarily lined up, although through what phrase am I looking for here? Through hidden channels, through undercover channels, through talking behind the scenes. Maybe he has spoken with other teams, but there's also every chance that the Mets never gave him permission to interview with another team. And this is simply a matter of he wants his contract to expire, so he has the ability to be a free agent, go around, meet with different teams, and interview for different positions. And if Antoine Richardson ends up becoming a bench coach somewhere and he gets a better job title than first base coach for his career, it was probably a wise move to test his market now. Now, the question would be, why would another team want him to be anything but a first base coach? I think if Antoine Richardson can convey to that team that he has the ability to duplicate what he did with the Mets and do it with another team, even if he's not the first base coach, just by taking his strategy, taking his ability to analyze film and bringing that to the table and be part of heading up some team's base running while still serving as a bench coach, or maybe it's a different role altogether. Maybe it's one of these major league field coordinators. If he ends up in a role that's not a first base coach job, I think you can give the Mets a pass. If he just takes more money from another team to be their first base coach, or he opts for a different situation, that doesn't look great on the Mets. And the fan base is irate because this is one of the coaches that they know is good. There is nobody that would dispute that Antoine Richardson is bad at his job. Now, I can make a devil's advocate argument, just that the outcry is a little extreme for a first base coach, but I wasn't happy when I found out the news that Antoine Richardson was not going to be back because, again, for something that it's so hard to quantify the impact of a coach, there was no disputing the impact of Antoine Richardson. And so it is hard to not look at this situation and say the Mets got worse today, because if Antoine Richardson's not coming back, their running game is not going to be as good as it was previously, no matter who they hire. It really feels like the Mets have or had the best first base coach in baseball, and now he is going to take to the open market and see what he gets. Now, maybe when he goes out to the open market, there is a world where he comes back to the Mets. But it does just make the fan base frustrated, and it is understandably so when in the matter of a couple of days, you have Desi Druschel, who was the assistant pitching coach. You poached him from the Yankees going into the 2025 season. Now he's going right back to the Yankees as the assistant pitching coach there, a lateral move. And then you also lose Antoan Richardson. Two of the coaches that you wanted to have come back are now leaving the organization. So we'll see what comes from this. I'm going to stop very far short of thinking that this means that the Mets are doomed or that the franchise is some type of an embarrassment. I'm not going that far, but I do think that this was a situation that should have been avoided in some shape or fashion here. Again, unless he ends up with another organization as a bench coach, if he ends up in some different role other than first base coach, but if he takes the same job that you were offering from another team for more money or more years, then you'd have to wonder, why didn't the Mets bend in negotiations? Why were they so dead set on whatever they felt was a fair market price for Antoine Richardson? Who knows? Again, none of us were in the negotiating room. This very well could have just been a situation where Antoine Richardson set a very high price for his services to remain with the New York Mets, knowing that he'd have a market and wanting to explore that market, wanting to take this season where his name got out there and he was considered the best first base coach in baseball, the guru behind Juan Soto's stolen base breakout, and just the Mets in general having such an incredible season on the base pass, that he wanted to get wined and dined on the open market and see if he could find an organization that looks a little bit better than the Mets. Maybe it's a smaller market team where there are inroads to be, again, a bench coach or a pathway to be a manager in a couple of years. Who knows? But it still sucks that the New York Mets are unlikely to have Antoine Richardson to return next season. And that just adds to the list of their coaching vacancies, as they have figured out their hitting coach. We'll talk about that in the next segment. But they still need now a third base coach, a first base coach, and they still got to figure out their entire pitching department. Who's going to be the pitching coach? Who's going to be the assistant pitching coach? Who's going to be the bullpen coach? There's a lot to discuss there. That'll be the final segment, talking about what's next. But first things first, let's discuss the Mets' new hitting coach, Troy Snitker. I'll get to that all in just a minute. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. The NFL season's back, and honestly, there's nothing better than being in the stadium surrounded by fans cheering on your team. But let's be honest, getting tickets can be a hassle. Between queues, login screens, prices jumping at checkout, it's frustrating. That's why I love Game Time, because the app gives the advantage back to fans. Game Time is fast. It's easy. It's backed by the Game Time guarantee, so you're always going to get 100% authentic tickets delivered on time and at the best price. Plus, all fees are included, so the price you see is the price you pay, and the app made it super simple. I could view my seat before I bought, so I know exactly what to expect when I arrived, and I was able to buy tickets in a matter of seconds, 2 taps. I was all set. Honestly, it's the fastest, cheapest, and least stressful way to get into the game. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, use that promo code LOCKEDONMLB. That's LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, go. Download Game Time today. If you're watching on YouTube, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Help us get closer to our next goal of 15,000 subscribers. We're now within 200. I really do appreciate all of you who continue to subscribe. Now, the Mets have a new hitting coach. Troy Snitker has taken the job. He was the hitting coach in Houston for years. And yes, if that name sounds familiar, it's not by an accident. Troy Snitker is Brian Snitker's son. Brian Snitker being the longtime manager of the Braves who just stepped down from his post after the 2025 season. His son, Troy, has been the hitting coach in Houston since 2019, or one of the two hitting coaches. It was him and Alex Cintrone who took over as co-hitting coaches going into that 2019 season, held that job all the way through this past season. And with the Astros failing to make the playoffs, they, similar to the Mets, clean house with their coaching staff. And that left him open for a job. And he takes the position now to be the hitting coach of the New York Mets. Now, I think this is a good hire on multiple fronts. For one, the Houston Astros have had some very successful offenses and some very successful players. Obviously, you have a Hall of Famer like Jose Altuve. You have probably Hall of Fame level bat might be stretching things a little bit for Yordan Alvarez because he's so early in his career still. There's still a lot that has to be left. And for a guy that's primarily a designated hitter, that's a whole other ballpark to get into Cooperstown. But this is a guy in Yordan Alvarez who, when he's been healthy, has been a top 5 bat in the game. You have, of course, guys who were always consistently good, like your veterans of an Alex Bregman or a Carlos Correa, but you even have a Jeremy Pena who had a great season this year and has had some good years in an Astros uniform. They have had a lot of success with their hitters in Houston. They were the best offense in baseball in 2019, the first season with Troy Snitker as one of the hitting coaches, and they were the best offense in baseball again in 2021. And this is by WRC Plus, weighted runs created plus. By that stat, they have been top 10 every single season except for 2025. And I don't necessarily think, oh man, these guys just completely blew it. The hitting coaches are the reason why the Astros didn't make the playoffs. I think it was more a lack of talent, quite honestly, and inconsistencies up and down that roster that led to them missing out on the postseason. I don't think that this guy's a bad hitting coach. If you could hold on to a job as a hitting coach for as long as he did, that speaks volumes of what you're able to do. And I also think this is the perfect hire to work in tandem with the Mets director of Major League Hitting in Jeff Albert. Jeez, I almost said Kenny Albert. I think that's somewhat a little bit different. I believe that's a broadcaster. No. So Jeff Albert worked actually alongside Troy Snitker in Houston, or at least their paths in the organization crossed. Then Albert went on to be the hitting coach for the Cardinals. And again, promoted from within, Snitker became the hitting coach in Houston. So both of these guys have ample experience as hitting coaches, which I think is very important. These aren't complete novices, even though they're younger coaches. These aren't guys that don't know what it's like to be in a dugout coaching major league hitters. They've both done that in the past. They, I think, are going to be very good collaborating with each other because, for one, Snitker has been collaborating with another hitting coach for years now. That's all he has ever known. So I don't think it's going to be a crazy change for him. If anything, he might have a little more autonomy just because he is the hitting coach. I don't know with what Jeff Albert's role is. Is he in the dugout during games? I don't know exactly how that's going to work. But I think both of these guys have an emphasis on understanding the analytics. They also care about the biomechanics. They care about bat speed. And a lot of these things are becoming more commonplace in the game. You're seeing it with the Toronto Blue Jays, who are in the World Series here. They have a brand new hitting coach this season, David Popkins, who worked at Driveline, very much has that analytical background, and has been credited with helping the Blue Jays and their hitters improve their bat speed and helping them, strike out less and just have a better approach in the box. I think you're going to see an improved offense this upcoming season. It's going to be hard to do much better than what the Mets actually produced in 2025 because with Juan Soto and Pete Alonso having the years that they did, the Mets were still, by a lot of metrics, a top 5 offense in baseball. But I think you might see some improvements from guys who are a little bit lower down the pecking order when it comes to some of the Mets hitters. Like maybe Luis Angel Acuna can have a little bit of a breakout. Maybe you could see more consistency from a Brett Beatty, or maybe Mark Vientos can return to his past glory. He certainly is a guy that could benefit from some revamping of his swing, some improvements to his bat speed. I think the Mets done a good job here, filling their need for hitting coaches we only know so much about these guys and what they bring to the table. But I think everything you read about Jeff Albert, everything you read about Troy Snitker, these are very well respected hitting coaches who are very much on the rise in the industry, who I think are really qualified hires to take over the hitting department for the Mets at the major league level. I think you're going to have two guys working hand in hand very well, hands on with their hitters that should be able to get good results for you. I think the Mets are in a very good spot here when it comes to their decisions they have made to fill the coaching staff up to this point. Kai Correa was a really good hire to be the bench coach, a guy that I think would have gotten some real consideration to be a manager elsewhere. So you have a up-and-coming coach or up-and-coming managerial candidate who is now going to be Carlos Mendoza's right-hand man. You got a lot of youth added to the staff. Not that the Mets had a particularly old staff previously. It's not like Eric Chavez or Jeremy Barnes are withering away as longtime baseball men, but you go from John Gibbons to Kai Correa. You have these two guys coming in. Again, you have Troy Snitker is 36. Jeff Albert's in his early 40s, I believe, if that. Let me actually confirm. He's 44. And we'll see where the Mets go at first base coach, at third base coach, those other positions. But right now, I think there should be a fresh set of voices that the Mets are going to have that will bring some life to this team. I think it was a good way for the Mets to turn the page to, a different feel for this team, knowing that a lot of the same hitters in particular could very well be returning here. I don't know how much the Mets are going to overhaul their roster. And so I think overhauling their coaching staff was still the right move for this team. We'll see how they replace Jeremy Hefner, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next segment because that's what's left to be done here. But I think they've done a good enough job up to this point with bringing in a couple of hitting coaches that should be a big benefit to this lineup in 2026. But in the next segment, I want to talk about what's left to do for this coaching staff. We'll get to all of that in just a minute. If you're an everydayer that always tunes into the show, make sure you become a Locked On Mets insider. This is our texting service. We get updates from me anytime news breaks on the Mets. You can ask me questions anytime. Take part in our Locked On Mets sign photo giveaways and get the line graphics sent to your phone each day during the regular season so you'll know who's in the starting lineup without ever having to go on social media. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, go to the episode description or to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. Now, what is left for the Mets to do to fill out their coaching staff? Obviously, priority number one is hire a new pitching coach. And I wonder if that is something that's going to happen at this point after the World Series. I mean, how many pitching coaches are unable to be interviewed until their contracts expire after the season? Who knows? But that's, I think, the next big shoe to drop because Jeremy Hefner, I don't think he was the problem either. Yes, the pitching fell apart for the New York Mets. I understand why they decided to clean house. But it's going to be tough to replace Jeremy Hefner. So that one is one that I'm very curious about. Now, of course, everyone's going to be wondering who's going to be the next first base coach for the New York Mets, who's going to be the next third base coach for the New York Mets. Those are a couple more big hires. They still have Jose Rosado, who could return as the bullpen coach. I believe he was given permission to interview elsewhere, but there is every chance that he'll choose to remain with the Mets after they hire a new pitching coach. As I mentioned earlier, Desi Drusel, though, will not be returning. He's going back to the Yankees. So even if the Mets hire a pitching coach tomorrow and they decide to keep Jose Rosado, there's still probably more pitching coaches, assistants to the pitching coach that will need to be hired to build out that department. And then you still have to figure out first base, third base. If there's going to be a new catching coach, I thought JP Arencibia would be a good fit for that. He was the bench coach, catching coach, a co-hitting coach in Syracuse. Obviously, you wear a lot of hats when you were on a minor league coaching staff, but he got rave reviews for helping Francisco Alvarez midseason. So I still think there's a good chance that he might join the staff in some capacity. You still have Danny Barnes is going to be the strategy coach who will remain in that role, and Rafael Fernandez was a coaching assistant that is expected to remain on staff. But the Mets still have their work cut out for them. We thought they might have all these hires wrapped up by the end of the World Series. I think at this point, it might be unlikely for them to fill out the rest of this staff over the next week here. We'll see. I think right now, as I'm recording this, and it's almost 2:00 in the morning, Game 3 of the World Series is still going on. A absolutely absurd game. I'm sure you can check out Locked On MLB Game Night for a full breakdown of that. I'm guessing we got a couple hosts that are going to go live once that whole thing ends. But with that said, considering how tight this World Series has actually been, to the surprise of a lot of us, because the way that the Dodgers took care of the Brewers, it felt like it was just going to be a route for them to another title. And the Blue Jays are showing that they're up to the task of really making it tough on the Dodgers. This could be a very iconic World Series. With that said, I think there's a good chance it goes back to Toronto. So you very well could have baseball throughout the rest of this week. Game 4 is going to come tonight, Tuesday night. Game 5, Wednesday night. Thursday will be an off day, as the series would then travel back to Toronto. And then you'd have Game 6 on Friday, Game 7 on Saturday. Once that ends, you're going to have a lot of coaches like Antoan Richardson that could be let out of their contracts and free to interview. And so there might be a short list of candidates for these positions the Mets still haven't got a chance to speak to yet. So that can still happen. They're also going to have to decide what they do with their own free agents. Who do they tender qualifying offers? I think it's pretty obvious that you tender one to Edwin Diaz. You can't tender one to Pete Alonso. I don't think that you would tender one to Ryan Helsley, considering how things went. So that's probably the extent of those decisions. But you also could negotiate with these guys. And I think Edwin Diaz could theoretically come to terms with the Mets on a contract before that 5-day window ends. Because, again, for free agents after the World Series, they have 5 days to negotiate with their current team before they become a free agent that's eligible to negotiate with all 30 teams. So Edwin Diaz, last time around when he hit free agency after the 2022 season, he signed a contract famously before the end of that 5-day window, something that we rarely see. So maybe Edwin Diaz re-ups with the Mets. I would love it if the Mets got a contract offer to Pete Alonso before the 5-day window ends. I actually have the framework of a contract that I think I'll do a show on later this week. But that's everything that is on tap for the Mets coming up here. And then your offseason starts. So hopefully the Mets have a clear-cut plan at this point for, what they want to do at first base, at third base with their pitching coach. How many candidates does that require them to interview? Only they know. But I imagine they at least have this process narrowed down to the point where it's not going to inhibit them in any way when it comes to addressing the roster, which is obviously the most important part of the offseason. But the Mets have made a couple of big hires. Their hitting department squared away. They have a bench coach. They just have a big question mark over at first base. They still got to figure out third base, and their pitching department is still pretty barren. So there's a lot of work left to be done, but I am sure the Mets will figure it out soon. And I'll be giving you updates with every new hire that is made, every news item that comes across. You will get your coverage here with Locked On Mets. Really do appreciate all of you for tuning into the show today. Make sure you follow, rate, review wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you want to be a Locked On Mets insider, you can find a link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/Locked On Mets. Thank you for making Locked On Mets your first listen or your first watch every day, not for your second watch. Again, check out Locked On MLB Game Night to get your update on everything going on with the World Series. You can find Locked On MLB Game Night on the Locked On MLB YouTube channel, as well as the Locked On MLB podcast feed.